If you've been following this channel for some time, or if you've simply been paying attention to the news over the last few days, you are likely to have heard the name Bashar Al-Assad repeated over and over again. The former Syrian dictator has been the subject of multiple war fronts and atrocities, from his rise as the supposed modernizing successor of his father Hafez to his incarnation as a bloodthirsty tyrant willing to do anything to eliminate rivals to his power. We've also covered the ruinous civil war which began in 2011 and in which Syria fractured and divided into multiple parts. With the passing of time, the civil war took a backseat in the minds and consciousnesses of the world, and it seemed as if Bashar al-Assad had largely weathered the storm. It seemed so, at least until the lightning offensive by rebel forces in November 2024, which toppled his regime and sent him scuttling off with his family to Russia. Syria now faces an uncertain future. What comes next for its beleaguered population? That's not clear, although we have attempted to analyze what could come next in a recent video on this channel. Check it out after this video, of course. And amidst the uncertainty that is likely to face Syria under its former jihadist new governors, there are perhaps those who would say that life under a brutal dictator might be preferable to the instability which looms so large. Better the enemy you know than the enemy you don't. Maybe. Who knows? But one thing is for sure, life under Bashar al-Assad was bad. It was really, really bad, so let's take a look at that, shall we? So let's go all the way back to the start and to the rise of the man equipped with both a medical license and a career as an ophthalmologist in Britain who would go on to use chemical weapons to put down his own people. Even before ascending to power in the year 2000, Bashar al-Assad already had a playbook on the vicious repression of protests which he inherited from his father and predecessor Hafez. Hafez al-Assad had ruled Syria as president from 1971 until his death. The same year, Bashar took over. In 1982, an uprising against his rule was led by the Syrian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, centered in the city of Hama. Hafez's response was to obliterate the Brotherhood as well as the entire city, resulting in tens of thousands of deaths. The event was described by US Foreign Affairs analyst Robin Wright as, quote, the single deadliest act by any Arab government against its own people in the modern Middle East. Bashar was not actually intended to be his father's successor, though. His older brother Basil was first in line to succeed Hafez, but this likelihood vanished unexpectedly in January 1994. Basil, who had an interest in fast cars, was on his way to Damascus Airport in his Mercedes ahead of a skiing holiday in the Alps. But amidst thick fog, his car plowed into a security barrier on the motorway at 240 kilometers per hour. He died instantly. A charismatic figure with a PhD in the military sciences, Basil had been groomed to take over Syria's leadership in a manner which reflected his father's influence. He was said to be fluent in French and Russian and had spent his career in the military, rising to brigade commander in the Alawite-dominated Presidential Guard. His death left Bashar, as Hafez's second son, primed to take over. Bashar was recalled from his residency at the Western Eye Hospital in London and became his father's heir apparent at the age of 29. Hafez al-Assad died in Damascus in June of 2000. Still only 34, Bashar was not yet old enough to assume the presidency according to the Syrian constitution. But this minor problem was averted by a constitutional amendment which lowered the requisite age from 40 to, you guessed it, 34. What a coincidence. Bashar al-Assad became the president of Syria on the 10th of July. Any hopes of his educated profile leading to a softer leadership style, well, that disappeared pretty quickly. The year he took office, a cautious attempt by Syrian public intellectuals to demand reforms began. Around 1,000 of them signed a petition calling for multi-party democracy, and others tried to form a democratic political party. But the so-called Damascus Spring didn't last long. Many notable academics were arbitrarily jailed, and some ended up in the hands of the Mukhabarat, the regime's notorious military intelligence service. Many were simply never heard from again. After the crushing of the Damascus Spring, an eerie quiet came to Syria. The Syrian public may have realized, no doubt to their very great dismay, that their prim and proper president was not to be trifled with. But amid the lull, Bashar al-Assad continued to rule with an iron fist, bulwarking his rule with the wanton use of the Mukhabarat, as well as various semi-official and loosely restrained militias collectively known in Syria as the Shabia. And during the quiet, Assad's vicious tactics extended to surrounding countries. In between a number of conflicts raging in the region, Syria became a key part of Iran's axis of resistance umbrella. His military supported Shiite factions in sectarian conflicts against Sunni Muslims in Lebanon and Iraq, exactly as his father Hafez had done before him from the 1970s. In 2005, when Lebanese Prime Minister Rafik Hariri was assassinated by a suicide bomb, it was suspected by many that Syria was ultimately responsible. Assad would later go on to receive support in kind from Iran as Hezbollah fighters arrived to bulwark his regime years later when the Syrian civil war erupted. In early 2011, the Arab Spring began, following the death of fruit vendor Mohamed Bouazizi in Tunisia. As protests spread across the Arab world, several longtime leaders and dictators were toppled. But in Syria, Bashar Al-Assad had seen what was coming and was prepared to do whatever it took to remain in power. Assad and his military support base dug in and crushed protests with a heavy hand. But opposition to his rule, mostly from the Sunni majority of Syria's population, was also unusually strong, buoyed by multiple external backers, foreign fighters, and the largely self-reliant Kurdish forces. The conflict soon spiraled into a vicious war of attrition. Unlike in most other states afflicted by the Arab Spring, the Syrian civil war had a religious sectarian element to it. Assad, his family, much of his close network, are members of the Alawite sect, a branch of Islam often described as being part of the wider Shia Twelver school. Alawites had long held a privileged position in the Assad family's nomenclature, with many members of both Assad cabinet, security apparati, and militaries belonging to the Alawite ethnicity, which represents 10 to 15% of Syria's population. When the war erupted, many members of the military abandoned service after being expected to open fire on protesters. But Assad could generally continue to count on his Alawite king as well as his Shiite allies from nearby countries, both of which remained an important power base for him throughout the conflict. Aside from the many rebel factions and the Kurds, who are predominantly Sunni Muslims, the war featured the involvement of Christian and Druze militias, leading to a complicated and multilateral patchwork of actors and alliances. The war raged on for 13 years, finally culminating with last month's fall of Damascus at the time of recording. And amidst the violence, Assad's viciousness came on full display for the entire world to see. Some of the depravity was inherited from his father Hafez, and some was entirely his own. Practically as soon as the war got off the ground, allegations of atrocities committed by all sides emerged, but few of the parties to the conflict stooped as low as regularly using chemical weapons in the course of the conflict, except one. In August 2013, government fired rockets leveled the city of Ghouta, adjacent to Damascus. At the time, Ghouta was controlled by the Syrian opposition, the same factions which later toppled the regime. The death toll from the assault on Ghouta was exceptionally high, with the US estimating that around 1,400 people were killed, including 426 children. It was found that many of the deaths were caused by the toxic nerve agent sarin. The Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, or OPCW, a global chemical weapons watchdog, later traced the perpetrator of the attack to helicopters, which had departed from the Damar airbase north of Damascus the evening the attack took place. This left responsibility for the attack almost indisputably at the feet of the Syrian government. But that attack, it wouldn't be the last. Prominent chemical attacks occurred again on the rebel-held city of Khan Sheikhoun in northern Syria in 2017 and on Douma, close to Damascus, in 2018. Over the course of the war, it was estimated that the government carried out hundreds more such attacks, mostly using chlorine gas. Chlorine had emerged as a weapon used by the government from 2014, according to Ol Solvang of Human Rights Watch. The chemical went on to be used in an estimated 91% of the alleged attacks during the course of the war. Chlorine is a halogen and common disinfectant known to most people as a sanitizer in swimming pools and an antiseptic, but chlorine is also highly toxic, and when it's released in weaponized form, it causes disorientation, eye irritation, and respiratory failure, and ultimately death by choking. The Global Public Policy Institute published a report in 2019 claiming that a total of 336 chemical attacks had been either comprehensively confirmed, or credibly sustained in the war until then. A further 162 were alleged but unconfirmed in the same period. The report also detailed that of 336, 328 that had been carried out by the Assad regime, the remaining 8 by the Islamic State. It was reported by NPR that the attacks collectively left hundreds of thousands dead. A Among the most notorious legacies left by the Assad dynasty in Syria were the prisons into which political undesirables would be shunted and subjected to all manner of depravity. This is an area of Bashar Al-Assad's playbook of brutality that was copied from his father Hafez, the architect of some of the worst detention centers known to mankind. During the Hafez era, a number of grisly prisons emerged for the suppression of political opposition. Noteworthy example was Tadmor, located in the depths of the desert, and into which Hafez had poured detainees for excruciating torture. But other sites were deliberately located in visible locations as a forewarning to opponents. Perhaps the most well-known was Meza prison, located on a hilltop overlooking western Damascus. Conditions in the prison were miserable, as revealed by accounts of detainees and images of its interior, which later surfaced. But going back to the start of Bashar's presidency, it was the Meza prison which seemed to offer some hope that reform was possible. In 2001, he consented to closing down the facility and releasing its roughly 600 prisoners. But that was a false dawn, seen later by some observers as a kind of trap to allow the Damascus Spring to manifest and to identify the intellectuals who went against the new regime. Meza may have remained closed, but, well, equally lethal prisons rose up instead. Many of the arrested intellectuals from the Damascus Spring were shipped off to another site in southern Syria, located about 30 kilometers from the capital. This place was known as Sednaya, a name which became a byword for the monstrousness of Assad's rule. Sednaya prison is a place so gruesome that it deserves a video of its own, which is exactly why we've made that video over on our sister channel Into the Shadows, so check that out if you want to. Nicknamed the Human Slaughterhouse, Sednaya's conditions were already unfathomable during the early years of the younger Assad's rule. However, the prison turned even more inhumane as the war began, and detained Syrians and non-Syrians alike were dragged into its confines to face every type of physical and psychological torture imaginable. Amnesty International estimated as early as 2016 that 13,000 people had met their end in Sednaya in the 5 years since the war had begun. However, it's difficult to accurately tell how many people were killed in the prison and the dozens of other detention centers operated by the Assad regimes. It is possible that the true number is just never going to be known. Sednaya became the immediate focus of the desperate families of missing Syrians when the regime toppled, and anguished exploration of the facility began as soon as Damascus fell on December the 8th. Many further accounts of the horrors of Sednaya will no doubt emerge in the weeks and months to come. In 2024, shortly before the rapid offensive which brought the war to an end, the territory of Syria remained splintered, divvied up between competing actors, and in some places across ethnic lines. In the east and northeast, around 1/4 of Syrian territory were, and continue to be, held by the Kurdish-controlled Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria, also known as Rojava. Along Syria's northern border, the Syria interim government, with the backing of Turkey, controlled a further 11% of Syria's territory. It was from here that the November 2024 offensive, which toppled Assad, was launched. But in the meantime, the remaining 2/3 of Syria were controlled by Assad and his government in Damascus, with the exception of a few small pockets intermittently held by resurgent factions of the Islamic State. And until the rapid offensive, it seemed apparent that the most acute phase of the fighting was over. When the Islamic State were seen as defeated in 2018, their demise was followed by a reduction in the intensity of fighting. The following year, the US-led military coalition, which had intervened in order to overcome the caliphate, began to scale back its operations in Syria. This allowed room for a Russian-overseen truce between other factions in the conflict the same year. By 2022, there had been no significant military offensives for over 2 years. But it was only then that the scale of the humanitarian toll of the conflict became most apparent. In 2023, the UNHCR reported that the conflict had resulted in over 12 million forcibly displaced Syrians, with some 6.8 million of these remaining internally displaced within the country. This figure, a massive amount for any country, represented more than 1/4 of Syria's estimated population of a little over 23 million. As if this wasn't enough, a devastating earthquake shook northern Syria and Turkey in February 2023, heaping further misery upon the resident populations and making the need for humanitarian aid more acute still. In the wake of the disaster, Assad made sure to capitalize on the chance to polish his image in the affected regions. Within days, he was seen alongside his wife Asma in areas most directly hit, posing for pictures, displaying concern for the survivors, and assuring locals of his commitment to providing relief without delay. But the humanitarian disaster got even worse. In 2024, UNICEF reported that a total of 16 million people were now in need of humanitarian help in Syria, with around 7.5 million of these being children. In addition to the internally displaced, as many as 5.1 million Syrians had fled abroad by the same year. As many as 3.5 million of those reside in Turkey, placing a strain on its society and leading to a heated debate on their repatriation. The debate only got more intense as Turkey's economy began to fail in the late 2010s, and the Syrian refugee population may have narrowly avoided forced return to their home country with the defeat of the opposition candidate Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu in the 2023 Turkish presidential election. Kılıçdaroğlu, leader of the centre-left CHP, had publicly declared that he would send all refugees back to their homes in a fiery speech before the election. He was marginally defeated in the election, receiving 47% of the popular vote to Erdogan's 52%. Understandably, a swift resolution to the conflict was perhaps in no country's greater interest than Turkey, perhaps best explaining its key role in the decisive offensive and being the foremost backer of the Syrian opposition and an intermittent ally of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. And in this regard, the ultimate result was undoubtedly the best possible scenario for the many Syrians living in Turkey. The threat to the personal security of any who would be repatriated to their homeland was quite severe. Assad's government remained as vindictive as ever, and it is possible that many returnees would have swiftly found themselves sent to the depths of Sedna or other detention centers. This is not even to speak of the fact that for many Syrians, their former homes now lay in the hands of a rebel group, the government, or in ruins. Many homes across Syria were destroyed by the fighting or by the devastating earthquake in 2023, but many were also repossessed under a callous piece of legislation known as Law 10. Law 10 was introduced following the defeat of the Islamic State in 2018. It allowed the government to repossess or demolish vacated or unclaimed homes left by Syrians displaced by the war. According to Human Rights Watch, the law was used by the Assad government to destroy properties whose owners could not prove property rights in good time. It was reportedly used also to level entire neighborhoods known to harbor sympathies for opposition groups. The group concluded that this practice of punitive destruction did, in fact, long precede the signing of Law 10 and had been used as a tactic by the government since the earlier stages of the war. This, no doubt, further contributed to the chaos and displacement among Syria's population. Given the dangers of a potential return to Assad's reach, the number of Syrians returning during the supposed quiet in the fighting was predictably low. UNHCR estimated this figure from the 5 million plus refugees who'd fled abroad to be no more than 50,000 at its peak in 2022, many of whom later fled again. The number of internally displaced returnees peaked at 250,000 the same year, a number still somewhat insignificant against a figure of 6.8 million internally displaced. Moreover, it is thought that those who returned included Syrians with sympathies towards Assad, or perhaps who stood to benefit from Law 10. In May of 2023, Syria was controversially re-elected to the Arab League, a regional organization comprising 22 countries from North Africa and the Middle East. While primarily a symbolic move, this did signal the redemption of Assad and his government in the eyes of its fellow Arab nations. Syria's membership of the League had been suspended in 2011 after Assad's ferocious crackdown on protests began. Recovering its membership in the Arab League was thus a major victory for the regime. But it wasn't necessarily that the Arab League had forgiven Assad. Syria, in spite of Assad, held some strategic cards of value to the League. In recent years, Syria's neighbor Lebanon began to suffer both a dire energy crisis and a spiraling economy in the wake of the Beirut port explosion of 2020. With Lebanon's only land borders being with Syria and Israel, some Arab leaders determined that it would be best to cooperate with Assad rather than to stoop to reaching Lebanon through Israel or let Lebanon spiral further. A country like Jordan, for example, being a historic foe of Israel but an ally of Lebanon, had a particular incentive to re-establish ties with Syria so that Assad would agree to the transfer of crucial energy resources between the allies. For this reason, the plan to bring Syria back was informally referred to as the Jordanian Initiative. Other incentives to engage with Assad included an attempt to wean Syria away from the influence of Iran, a particular objective for Saudi Arabia in which the 2023 Arab League conference took place, and also to maintain the imperfect equilibrium perceived by some to have come to the war at that time. Certainly, nobody wanted a return to the days of the Islamic State, many of whose members remained in custody in either Assad's concentration camp-style centers or in prison camps in northeastern Syria under Kurdish oversight. According to Human Rights Watch, the number of people held in detention by the Kurds was almost 70,000 in 2023, including some 23,000 Syrian and 42,000 foreign affiliates of the fallen caliphate. Many of the sites were therefore considered ticking time bombs due to the fundamentalist ideology festering within, a risk seen as particularly high should the war have spontaneously reignited against Rojava. Now, with that being said, there was certainly no consensus on the redemption of Assad. Qatar, Kuwait, and Morocco objected to the normalization of relations with Damascus, continuing to instead label Assad's leadership of Syria as illegitimate. In addition, there are other signs which indicate that Assad's place among the Arab leadership was not entirely secure. Although he received a formal invitation to attend the United Nations Climate Change Conference of COP28 in the United Arab Emirates in 2023, he was conspicuously absent at the time of the event. Some observers commented that this was due to the risk of his arrest by authorities in the UAE due to extradition and legal cooperation agreements that it signed with France in 2007. As a matter of fact, a French court had issued an arrest warrant for Assad just 2 weeks before the beginning of the conference. Still, with the support of several powerful backers, such as Russia, suffice to say that the state seemed to have survived the Syrian civil war. While certainly not unscathed, Assad appeared, with his appearance at the Arab League, to have re-emerged as the recognized governor of the Syrian state and its people. But, well, all of that changed in late 2024. Now, it remains to be seen what will come next. Will the new governors of Syria bring with them the change hoped for so long? Will they offer the beleaguered country the democratic transition hoped for but brutally scuppered in both 2001 and 2011? Or will the jihadist origins of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and the descendants of Jabhat al-Nusra take precedence, risking turning Syria into the Levantine equivalent of Afghanistan under the Taliban? Moreover, will the aphorism "power corrupts" and "absolute power corrupts absolutely" result in the new administration repeating the brutal mistakes of the Assad regime? I suppose all we can ask at the end of this video is, well, what do you think? Thanks for watching.